Just a little more.
What if I told you? A man once read his late wife's journal aloud to a baby Bigfoot in the remote Sawtooth Mountains of Idaho, 1984. A 52-year-old widowed ranger broke every rule. He rescued an injured young Bigfoot trapped under a fallen tree, fed it salmon and goat milk, and read it the words of a woman long gone. For 5 weeks, he gave it warmth, until one morning its mother appeared at the doorstep. The little one left, but not without placing its hand to its chest, a gesture he once taught it. This isn't folklore. Every detail was recorded in a sealed journal, hidden for over 2 decades, and recently discovered by a young ranger who followed the same trail. What he found confirmed everything. You're about to witness a quiet, sacred bond between a man and a creature the world dismisses as myth. A story of trust, sacrifice, and silence that speaks louder than proof. One that will change the way you see wilderness. Forever. Because deep in that forest, something reached back. Not with violence, but with memory. If you skip this video, you may never hear the most human Bigfoot story ever told. The storm had passed 2 nights ago, but the scent of rain still clung to the earth like a memory that wouldn't let go. The high ridgelines of the Sawtooth Mountains were draped in mist, like old wounds refusing to close. Pines loomed tall and unmoving, their needles slick with moisture. Beneath them, the forest floor was soft and uneven, scattered with damp leaves and blackened bark. Mushrooms pushed up like stubborn ghosts. The silence was so full it pressed against the eardrums. A hawk cried somewhere far off, thin and distant. Howard Mason, How, as folks once called him, moved slowly along the trail, boots squelching faintly in the mud. He paused to lean on his walking stick, his breath visible in the chilly air. The fire scar on his left arm, that thick, pale ridge of melted flesh from the wildfire in '68, was tingling like it always did when the season turned. He rubbed it absently through his canvas jacket sleeve. Still sore after all these years, still reminding him of everything he couldn't save. The trees opened slightly ahead, revealing a slope littered with debris from the recent storm. Branches twisted off, a few saplings bent and cracked, and one massive pine that had fallen crosswise into a ravine, its roots torn skyward like exposed ribs. Hal stopped. He heard it then. Not the usual bird call or creak of wood. No wind, just a noise. A low, wavering sound, not loud, but unmistakably pained. A kind of whimper. Then silence, then another one shorter this time. Hal tilted his head, scanning the tree line. The sound was coming from behind the fallen tree. He stepped carefully down the incline, feeling the mud give beneath each step. The scent of pine sap was thick. As he neared the massive trunk, he saw movement. A shape. Not a deer, not a bear. Something smaller but upright. A child. He blinked. No, not human. It was covered in soaked, tangled fur, curled up against the base of the tree, breathing shallow, its right leg pinned awkwardly beneath the splintered trunk. The fur was matted with mud and pine needles. It trembled when he approached, pulling back slightly, shoulders pressed to the earth. Big eyes stared at him, dark brown, almost black, shining with water and fear. He froze. Every instinct told him to back away. He'd seen enough signs in the woods over the years, odd tracks, nests in impossible places, but never this close. Never a living one. It was a young Bigfoot, juvenile, 4 feet tall, maybe less with the leg trapped, face broad and flat, with a low brow and a wide mouth pulled tight in pain. Its chest rose and fell fast. A broken moan escaped from its throat. Hal didn't move for a long while. He remembered the regulation manual. Do not interfere with wildlife, especially those not catalogued. Do not approach wounded creatures. Do not insert yourself into natural selection. But this wasn't about rules. This was about that look, those eyes. The kind of look he'd seen once before when his wife Sarah had reached for his hand from the hospital bed. Just before her fingers slackened and the monitor flatlined. The same silence now. The same impossibility. The same helpless ache. He knelt beside the creature slowly, careful not to startle it. His knees sank into the moss. The air felt colder down here. The creature flinched when he reached for the trunk. He whispered low, almost to himself, "I won't hurt you," not expecting it to understand, just needing to say it. He braced both hands against the bark and pushed with all his weight. The tree shifted just slightly. Not enough. He glanced at the leg. It wasn't crushed, only wedged. Deep bruising, maybe dislocated. Hal stepped back, then swung his bag off his shoulder and pulled out his small hatchet. The creature tensed. Its breath came sharper now. Hal didn't look at it. He just started chopping. Each strike echoed through the clearing, bouncing off the trunks like thunderclaps. Sweat trickled down his neck despite the chill. His arms burned. His old shoulder popped. But he kept chopping, clearing enough of the smaller limbs away to wedge his hands under the trunk. He counted silently. 1, 2, 3, and lifted. The log shifted. Enough. The creature yelped as it scrambled back, dragging its leg free. Then it collapsed sideways, panting hard. Hal let the trunk fall and staggered back onto the ground, gasping. A fine mist clung to his beard. His heart pounded. The creature looked at him. It didn't run, didn't growl. Just lay there, chest heaving, eyes still wide with a mix of fear and something else. Curiosity. Hope. Hal removed his jacket and crept forward slowly. He didn't reach for it. He just laid the jacket beside it and waited. The creature sniffed it. Its massive hand pressed into the fabric. Then, trembling, it shifted toward him. He saw the blood now, dark streaks down the ankle. He could feel its heat, smell the wet fur. He slipped the jacket gently over its shoulders. It didn't resist. When he placed a hand behind its back and the other beneath its knees, it let out a soft grunt, but didn't fight. Hal stood with a low groan, hoisting its surprisingly solid weight into his arms. Heavy, like carrying a small bear. Its arm fell across his shoulder. Its head slumped against his chest. He began walking uphill, back toward the trail. Mud clung to his boots. The trees seemed to lean closer, watching. He didn't look back at the ravine. He didn't need to. Halfway to the ridge, just as the trail curved along a shelf of stone, he felt something shift in the mist behind him. A pressure, a presence. He turned. There, not 20 yards back, just beyond the line of trees, stood a figure, still as a statue, easily 8 feet tall, shoulders like a boulder, long arms, fur the color of burned bark, eyes that caught the faintest light. It didn't move, didn't approach, just stood there watching. Hal didn't breathe. The young one stirred faintly in his arms but didn't wake. The figure raised one arm, slow, deliberate, and then stepped backward into the mist. Gone, as if it had never been there at all. The rest of the way home was quiet. No birds, no wind. Only the sound of his boots and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the creature in his arms. When he reached the edge of the tree line, the sun had begun to slip behind the peaks. The cabin stood like a memory, half hidden by fog and old pine. He crossed the porch, shouldered open the door, and stepped into the familiar dim warmth of the cabin. Laid the creature gently onto a wool blanket near the stove. Its fur steamed slightly in the firelight. He moved slowly, his body aching from the effort, but his mind strangely clear. He stoked the fire, boiled water, pulled the old kettle from its hook and let the warmth fill the space. The creature stirred again. Eyes opened, met his. He said nothing, and neither did it. They just watched each other, two beings from different worlds, bound together by silence, by a wound in the forest, by something older than language. Outside, the fog thickened. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and the scars on Hal's arm, on his memory, began to warm ever so slightly, as if they too remembered what it meant to be held. The snow came early that year, not in a grand sweep like a storm sweeping down from Canada, but in slow, persistent layers, each morning adding a little more weight to the world. The cabin crouched beneath its thickening white roof like an animal curled against the cold. Smoke drifted from the chimney in tired ribbons. Inside, the wood stove breathed life into the quiet rooms. It was warm in patches, cold in others. The kind of cold that crept in through the floorboards, settled in the corners, and never quite left. Howard Mason had learned to live with that kind of cold, but this winter something had shifted. Something waited in the corner just beyond the firelight, breathing a little louder than the wind. He called it in his mind. Not because he wanted to, because he had to. The minute he gave it a name, it would be real in ways he might never be able to undo. The young Bigfoot slept now, curled in a corner on the pile of wool blankets he'd dragged from the chest under the stairs. Its breathing had softened over the days. No longer panicked, no longer shallow. It slept like something that had never really felt safe until now. He stirred a pot over the stove, the smell of boiled salmon and goat's milk filling the cabin. A strange mix, but it worked. He'd learned fast what it could keep down, what made it gag, what made it curl away like a frightened child. The goat milk was from old Emmeline's ranch 2 ridges over. She still owed him for that fence he helped mend back in '82. The fish he caught fresh every other day, hiking out past the frozen stream, breaking the ice with the back of his axe, casting out with hands that didn't grip quite as tight as they used to. He ladled the stew into a wide tin bowl and crouched low beside the creature. It stirred, opened its eyes halfway, brown, dark, searching. He didn't speak, just set the bowl down gently and backed away. It sat up slowly, moved like it still didn't quite believe it wasn't dreaming. One long hand cupped the bowl, the other steadied it. Steam rolled up, touching its face. It closed its eyes and breathed it in before eating. He returned to the table, sat down in his creaky chair, and opened the old leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed, some edges curled with age. Sarah's handwriting filled every other line, neat, looping cursive, sometimes messy when she was excited. The book still smelled faintly like the lilac oil she used to dab behind her ears. He didn't mean to speak out loud when he read. It just happened. Some nights it was barely a whisper. Some nights it was his only way to feel like she was still there, listening. Tonight was one of those nights. September 6, 1977. He read quietly, eyes scanning the words. The fireflies were out again, and you forgot to shut the coop. The hens were halfway to the woods when I found them. I pretended to be mad, but... He stopped, swallowed. But it made me laugh, Hal. You make me laugh even when I don't want to. He closed the journal, not because he wanted to, because he had to. The creature was staring at him now, not eating, just staring. Its expression unreadable, its mouth slightly parted, one hand still on the bowl. He looked back, unsure what to say. Then it moved. It crossed the floor in 4 long strides, stopped in front of him, tall now, taller than he expected, even slouched and cautious. Its arms hung low, hands loose. It tilted its head, then did something that stopped his breath cold. It reached out and pressed its hand to his chest, right above the heart. He didn't move. It held it there for a moment. Just the weight of that hand, the heat of its palm, the strange feel of thick, matted fur against flannel. Its eyes stayed locked with his. There was no menace, no confusion. Just listening, not with ears, with skin, with feeling. And then it dropped its hand and returned to the blankets. Curled up, closed its eyes. He sat there for a long time. The fire snapped once, shooting sparks inside the iron belly of the stove. He thought about Sarah, thought about the last time someone had touched him without needing anything in return. Just to feel that he was still real. The next few days passed like the hush before a snowfall. No great events, no sharp changes. Just time, moving through the cabin like a slow wind. The creature, he refused to call it a pet, a guest, a friend. He didn't call it anything. Began to move more freely. Limped at first, then padded softly through the rooms. It followed him outside once when he went to fetch more wood. Stood under the eaves, watching the snow fall on his shoulders. He offered it his spare coat. It didn't take it. Just watched him stack logs. Watched the way he leaned, the way he winced when his back tightened, like it was learning him. At night, it began sleeping closer to the stove, curled into itself, occasionally muttering low sounds like distant thunder. One night, when the wind howled hard against the walls and the sky dumped white across the world, he woke to find it huddled beside his chair, head resting on the old flannel blanket Sarah used to keep by the fire. He didn't speak, just watched it breathe, listened to its slow inhale and exhale, a rhythm he began to memorize, a rhythm that somehow steadied his own. Still, he didn't name it. He wanted to. The names came to mind sometimes. Birch, Hollow, Ember. Names that sounded more like places than people. But names meant memory, meant ownership, meant something he wasn't sure either of them could carry. So he called it nothing until the morning light came red and cold through the frost-coated windows, and the rhythm changed. He knew before he opened his eyes. Something in the air, a silence different than the one he'd grown used to. Not absence, stillness, like the forest itself was holding its breath. He sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes. The fire was still burning low. The creature wasn't by the stove. He stood, looked around. The cabin felt wider somehow, emptier. Then he saw the shadow on the porch. He opened the door. She stood just beyond the steps, towering, still, fur dusted with snow, shoulders like a fallen spruce, eyes like coal that still held heat. The young one stood inside the doorway, half hiding behind him. There was no sound, no growl, no step forward, just the way she waited, the way her eyes never left his face. He stepped back, not out of fear, out of understanding. The young one brushed past his leg, limping slightly. No hesitation, no glance back. It stopped halfway to her, turned, looked at him, raised one hand, pressed it against its chest, right where it had felt his heartbeat, then turned back toward the trees. She waited until it reached her. Then they vanished into the snow-draped pines without a sound. Hal stood there a long while, bare feet on the cold wooden floor, the door still open, letting in the winter. The cabin felt like a photograph, still, quiet, too full of something he couldn't name. He sat by the stove again that night, opened the journal, read it aloud, even though no one listened. Because sometimes the listening wasn't the point. Sometimes the silence was. And that silence, once hollow, now held a shape, a memory, a heartbeat pressed into his chest, a promise that somewhere in the trees, something wild and wordless had remembered him, had touched him, had chosen to go, but not to forget. And long after the fire died down, he stayed there in the chair, the shadows breathing around him, the frost climbing the windows, and the rhythm of a forest now missing a weight that had once made it feel less empty. The storm that tore through the Sawtooth Mountains had come with the kind of fury that left behind a silence worse than wind. For 3 days it howled, snapping trees like matchsticks, clawing at the ridgelines with icy fingers, pushing torrents of water down into gullies that hadn't seen motion in years. And then, Just as suddenly as it came, it was gone. The forest didn't recover right away. It stood there stunned, stripped in places, flooded in others. Branches hung where they didn't belong. Mud clung to roots like old blood, and the air smelled like wet stone and broken bark. Howard Mason stood at the edge of the clearing, hands resting on the handle of the shovel he carried more out of habit than need. At 60 years old, his legs didn't move as fast as they once did, but the old rhythm was still there, buried somewhere beneath the ache in his hips. His beard had turned mostly white now, his face creased deep from wind and loss, and years of saying little to anyone but trees and firelight. The cabin behind him had survived, though the porch roof had needed patching and the trail up from the river was a mess of washed-out steps and fallen limbs. But he hadn't come out to assess damage. Not really. He stepped forward, boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. The morning sun filtered through broken trees in jagged beams. His breath showed in little clouds. Everything was still wet. Everything felt heavier than it should. He walked with his head low, counting new breaks, noting what would need clearing. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that felt too alert, like the woods had paused mid-breath, waiting to see what would happen next. That's when he saw her. At first, she was just a darker shape among the trees, but as his eyes adjusted to the pattern of shadow and bark, the shape didn't match anything natural. It was too still, too deliberate. She stood near the edge of a small rise, halfway obscured by a downed pine. She didn't move when he looked up, just stood there, watching, his breath hitched. He knew. Even after all this time, he knew. The same broad shoulders, the same heavy fur, now flecked with gray and streaked with mud. Taller than any man by 2 feet at least. Her arms hung long, her chest rose slow and deep like a sleeping bear. But her eyes weren't those of a bear. They held something else. Recognition, memory, patience. Howe didn't speak. He didn't move at first. Then, slowly, he let the shovel fall from his hand, the metal striking a patch of stone with a dull clink. He took a single step forward, then another, until the tension in his legs gave and he dropped down into a seated position right there on the wet ground. His knees bent up, arms resting across them. He didn't try to reach for her, didn't try to close the space, just sat. She remained where she was, not retreating, not approaching. The wind barely moved. A branch creaked overhead. He could hear the slow rhythm of his own breath. Her head tilted slightly, not in confusion, in knowing. His throat tightened without warning. The sensation caught him off guard. A flicker of heat behind the eyes. He blinked hard but didn't look away. She didn't either. The staring wasn't a challenge. It was an echo. A thread pulled tight between 2 points that had once touched and drifted apart, and now hummed with everything they didn't say. Tears welled and broke. Not loud, just there. He didn't wipe them away. They left clean tracks through the grit on his cheeks. The sun shifted slightly overhead, casting her in softer light. Her fur shimmered in places. Her shoulders rose once, as if with a long, ancient breath. And then she turned, stepped back, 1 foot, then the other, into the shadows, and was gone. He sat there until the cold seeped in deep enough to make his spine ache. Then he stood slowly, bones cracking, and made his way back to the cabin. He didn't speak the rest of the day, didn't light the radio, didn't eat, just sat in the same chair by the window, staring at the edge of the trees like he expected them to part again. The next morning, the frost was thick on the porch. The sky was pale, flat, and empty of birds. He opened the door with the same habitual motion he'd used for decades, stepped out to grab a log for the stove, and froze. Just beyond the first step, maybe 2 feet from the edge of the boards, was a footprint. Not his, not from any animal that belonged to this place. Large, wide, toes splayed, pressed deep into the frost-crusted dirt. clear as if it had been cast in plaster. One footprint, no others. No trail, no drag, no hint of where it came from or where it led. Just a mark. He crouched slowly, his knees popping, and stared at it. Not with disbelief. Not even with wonder. Just something close to reverence. He didn't touch it. Didn't breathe too hard. He stayed there for nearly 10 minutes, just studying it. The way the weight had pressed into the heel, the slight curl of the toes, the melt starting at the edges from the morning sun. He whispered, not to the woods, not to her, just to the silence. "You remember too." Then stood. He didn't tell anyone, didn't write it down. But that day, he cleaned the porch, chopped more wood than he needed, and fixed the loose hinge on the front gate even though it hadn't bothered him in years. That night he laid a blanket by the stove, not because he expected anyone to use it, but because memory had weight. And sometimes the only way to carry it was to leave space for it to sit beside you in the dark. The footprint was gone by noon the next day. The sun melted what was left of the frost, but the spot where it had been stayed untouched. He stepped around it without thinking, and each night after, as the wind rose and the forest began to stitch itself back together, he found himself looking out the window a little longer than before, eyes tracing the tree line for a shape that might never come again, but had once stood still long enough to be remembered. The world didn't shift all at once. No great change came roaring in, but something small moved inside him. A thaw, a bend in the path he thought had long since hardened. And he realized not all goodbyes are forever. Some just take a little longer to find their way back through the woods. The meadow had changed since he last sat here. The light touched it differently now, softer, lower, with a deeper hue of gold that clung to the tall grass like a secret waiting to be spoken. Summer had settled in gently after the hard spring, and the scent of warm pine was thick in the air. Small white butterflies danced above the clover. Bees moved slow from flower to flower. But Howard Mason didn't come for the scenery. He came for the silence. Not the kind that filled empty cabins or cold beds. This was the old silence, the one that lived in the woods before people put names on things, the kind you could sit in without needing to say anything back. He unfolded the weathered camp chair with one hand and eased into it with a quiet grunt. The canvas creaked under his weight. He had a notebook in his coat pocket, not for taking notes like he used to for the Forest Service, but for the words that came when he didn't expect them. He didn't open it yet, just held it in one hand, the other resting on the armrest. His cane leaned against the leg of the chair, forgotten for now. The clearing stretched wide in front of him, ringed by pines and tamaracks, the grass moving in slow currents beneath a breeze that never fully stopped. It was the same place where it had all started. Years ago, a frightened creature pinned beneath a tree, its wide eyes searching for something it didn't have a name for. It was the same place where he'd once felt a heartbeat through fur and silence. And now, it was the only place where he could breathe like he wasn't waiting. He didn't have to wait long. The figure emerged just past the far line of trees. No sound, no warning, just there. As if it had always been. She didn't hide this time, didn't keep to the shadows. The adult Bigfoot stood tall, fur catching streaks of sunlight, the gray more noticeable now, like lichen on bark. She walked slowly, not in fear, but with caution that spoke of memory. He didn't move, not a twitch. She came closer than before, 20 feet, 15. She stopped maybe 10 feet away, near a cluster of sunflowers bending slightly under their own weight. Her shoulders rose and fell once. Then she lowered herself slowly to the ground, crossing her legs like a person might, arms resting on her knees. Her eyes didn't leave his. The same eyes, the same dark wells of thought. He nodded, just once. She blinked slowly but did not look away. The forest around them pulsed with a stillness that made the world feel smaller, closer. He opened the notebook, not to write, but to hold it like something familiar between them. Pages fluttered faintly in the wind. He whispered aloud, "Not for her, but not for her either. We don't need to speak," he said softly. "The silence is enough." She didn't move, but something in her shoulders eased, like she'd heard him, or felt it in the air between them. They sat that way for what might have been an hour. A breeze shifted through the trees and stirred the grass in waves. A red-tailed hawk circled once, then drifted out of sight. Time didn't press down on them. It folded around them like an old quilt. He thought about Sarah, about the nights she'd read poetry by candlelight, her voice quiet, steady, always leaving a pause after the last line like the poem hadn't truly ended. That same pause lived here now, between them. A mutual understanding that didn't need to be named. He opened to a blank page and, without looking down, wrote one sentence. "We are not alone when we listen." The pencil scratched faintly on the paper. She didn't leave, not like before. Instead, she laid back in the grass, one hand behind her head, eyes watching the sky like someone who used to watch the stars from a cabin porch. Howe didn't say a word. He watched the way her chest rose and fell, the rhythm steady and calm. She could have crushed a full-grown man without effort, could have broken him in half like kindling. But she didn't. She breathed beside him. That was enough. Branches cracked somewhere to the east. A voice carried faintly through the woods, young, unsure. "Hello?" He stiffened. The Bigfoot rolled to one side and pushed up to a crouch, her head turning fast toward the sound. "Someone there?" the voice called again. He recognized it. The new ranger, Megan Rowe, fresh from training, still bright-eyed, still believing the world could be cataloged neatly if she just followed the manual. She'd taken to walking the edges of his sector, sometimes bringing sandwiches wrapped in wax paper, leaving them on his porch like offerings to a stubborn ghost. He looked at the Bigfoot. She looked at him. No panic, just waiting. He stood slowly, groaning from the stiffness in his knees, turned toward the woods. "Over here, Megan." Her footsteps quickened. She broke through the trees, breath short, boots scuffing dirt. She stopped when she saw him. Then her eyes widened as she looked past him. He didn't turn around. Megan's mouth opened, then closed. Her hand dropped from her side, no longer reaching for her camera. He still didn't turn, just said, "You see her?" "Yes," she whispered. "She sees you too." Silence again. Then Megan stepped back, just one step. The Bigfoot rose to her full height, a quiet motion, not threatening. Her eyes flicked to the girl, then back to him. Megan's voice came again, smaller. "I won't tell." He finally turned and looked at the Bigfoot. She stared at Megan with the same calm weight she gave to trees and sky and moonlight. Then she stepped back into the grass, turned slowly, and walked back toward the tree line. Megan exhaled sharply. "My God!" Howe sat down again, bones heavy. "She's been coming back," he said. "On her terms." Megan crouched beside the chair, watching the trees. "How long?" He didn't answer. The next morning, the headline ran in the local paper. A blurry photo of a footprint, size 18 or more, caught in a patch of dry soil along the trail. Some tourist had snapped it before the wind kicked up. "Is something lurking in Sawtooth?" the headline read. Beneath it, quotes from the Park Service. Warnings about bears. A short mention of cryptid folklore. It would have made him laugh if it hadn't sunk so cold in his stomach. That afternoon, he walked the trail alone, carving new marks in the soil to break the shape of that print. When he reached the clearing, she wasn't there, but he felt it, that she had been, that she would be again. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat. He turned a slow circle, eyes tracing the tall trees. Somewhere nearby, he knew Megan was watching too. He sat, opened the notebook, wrote one more line beneath the last. "We are only hidden when the wrong eyes are looking." He didn't sign his name, didn't need to. The silence was enough. And in that silence, he waited. Not for her to return, but for the world to hush long enough for something real to step forward again. And maybe next time, someone else would be quiet enough to see it. The sun sank slowly. Shadows grew tall, and the old chair creaked beneath him as if it too remembered what it meant to sit still and believe. Late summer brought the kind of heat that seemed to hum under your skin, even after the sun had dipped behind the ridges. The pine needles smelled sharper. Dust clung to your boots and refused to shake loose. And the forest, usually so private, began to feel exposed, like something sacred was being slowly unwrapped by hands that didn't understand what they were touching. It started with a newspaper article. A tourist from Boise, passing through with his teenage son, had snapped a photo of a massive footprint near the base of Granger's Pass. The print wasn't fresh, but the story was. Local station picked it up. Then the national radio. A week later, 3 separate trucks with out-of-state plates were spotted camped just outside the protected zones, each loaded with hunting gear that didn't belong anywhere near that part of the Sawtooths. Howard knew it before Megan even came to tell him. The feeling had settled in his gut days before. Too many unfamiliar boots on old trails, too many voices carrying through trees that didn't know their names. He could smell it in the air like diesel and camera flash. The forest was changing its posture, going rigid, breathing shallow. She came to his cabin just before dusk. Her truck barely cooled when she stepped out with a paper in her hand and worry in her eyes. He didn't open the door. He was already sitting on the porch, sharpening a small blade he barely used anymore. Her voice was quiet, almost embarrassed. "They're planning to shut down sections of trail near your perimeter. Unofficially at first. Wildlife concern, they're calling it. But I heard a deputy say the word operation, like they're organizing." He didn't answer, just turned the blade once more against the stone and looked out into the darkening trees. Megan stayed quiet a long time before adding, "I thought you should know." "They're coming." He gave a small nod. Not a thank you, just a confirmation. She understood. And then she left, her engine grumbling down the dirt road, swallowed again by pine and evening. That night, he waited until the forest was black and the frogs had started their song before he packed. Not much. A small canvas satchel, 2 canteens, a compass, and a stack of old trail markers he'd kept from the 70s. Red for danger, blue for safe, green for circles. He didn't bring food, wouldn't need it. By moonlight he moved into the hills. Slow, steady, the way his feet remembered from decades before. The trails still knew him. The ground gave beneath his weight in the familiar places. He didn't walk toward them. He walked around. Rewrote the paths in the language of confusion. Branching trails that led nowhere. False signs hammered into tree trunks, clumps of brush cut to resemble game paths. He doubled back often, dragged his boot heel to mimic deer. Once, he even smeared muskrat scent on a ridge stone to draw attention away from a canyon below. 2 nights later, he found the first trap. It wasn't subtle. A steel-toothed jaw anchored to a length of chain, tucked just beneath the moss near a deer run. The kind of thing no conservationist would ever allow. His hand trembled when he sprung it, the sound of metal snapping through the quiet like a shot. He stared at it a long while, then opened his satchel and poured in a mixture of old coffee grounds, ash, and pine sap. He tossed it into the stream below. The chain followed with a soft metallic splash. It wasn't the only one. By the 4th night, he destroyed 5. The men had come in small groups. 3 here, 4 there. Loud, clumsy. Some with expensive gear they didn't know how to use. They lit fires too bright. Drank beer from cans they didn't carry out. Shot at trees for fun. Laughed too hard at their own fear. But the forest didn't laugh back. He led them wrong. Marked paths in chalk that vanished with dew. Left boot prints that circled themselves. One morning, he found an entire group camped at the base of a bluff, thinking they were near the canyon. They were 12 miles off. He passed within 30 feet of them. They never saw him. but it was wearing him down. His legs didn't carry him like before. His shoulder barked each time he reached too far. The burn scar on his arm throbbed at night like an old clock, ticking time he no longer had. One evening just before dawn, he climbed the rocky rim of Larkspur Point to remove a flare trap someone had strung across the high path. The wind was sharp up there, cutting through his jacket. As he worked the last line of paracord free, his boots slid. Just a bit, but enough. The rock beneath him gave. A chunk the size of a stovetop tore loose, sending him backwards. His hand flailed for grip, but found only air. Then, something stopped him. Not the ground, not the brush. A grip, massive, firm, unmistakably warm. It caught him under the arm like a tree root reaching up from the stone. His other hand scrambled for purchase, found a lip of rock, pulled. When he turned back, panting hard, there was nothing there. No shape, no breath, no shadow. Just the night, and the silence that felt suddenly not alone. He sat there for several minutes, chest heaving, fingers trembling. His back hurt like hell, but he was alive. He looked out over the valley, clouds below, moon above, and the entire Sawtooth Range stretched wide and breathing like a living thing. That morning, back at the cabin, he wrote the report. A fake one. Made it look like a mudslide had destabilized the northern path. Included GPS coordinates for areas he knew no one should be near. Recommended temporary closure under the guise of safety protocol. He stamped it with his old seal and drove it down to the ranger office himself. Megan didn't say a word when she saw it, just read it slowly, then locked it in the drawer behind her desk. She met his eyes. He nodded. She nodded back. That night, he sat by the fire. It was too quiet. The wind had died. The crickets, too. He looked around the cabin, the papers spread across the floor. Maps, letters, sketches, journals, the full weight of years scattered like dry leaves. His hand reached for the old lighter. He opened it, clicked, watched the flames settle steady against the metal lip. Then he lit the maps, the letters. The corners caught fast. Fire doesn't wait. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. He just watched the pages curl, blacken, drift upward like ghosts. When it was done, he took the last of Sarah's journals, bound in twine, soft with time, and slid them into a cedar box. Then sealed it shut with 3 nails and set it beneath the floorboards, behind the loose plank no one else knew about. The next morning, he walked the trail again. No satchel, no flare, just him. The forest was damp from a night mist. A redtail called overhead. In the distance, a branch snapped in a rhythm he recognized but couldn't explain. He didn't turn around, not because he wasn't afraid, but because sometimes the most sacred things only survive when they know you'll walk away without asking for more. And somewhere behind him, deep in the trees, the watchers remained, breath low, steps silent, waiting for the noise of man to fade just enough for them to come back into the world whole again. Winter had come in layers that year, slow, creeping, and unforgiving. It didn't arrive with a sudden storm or a blanket of white like in the old days, but with a steady ache that built day by day, settling into the bones of the land and the people still trying to live on it. By early December, the banks of the Salmon River had turned to brittle sheets of ice, and the cabins scattered along its edges looked like they belonged to ghosts. One of those cabins sat lower than the others, near the bend where the river curved hard against a shelf of stone. The man who lived there no longer kept a clock, no longer checked the calendar, and no longer called anyone by name. Howard Mason's hands had changed. They didn't grip things like they used to. He dropped his spoon twice that morning trying to eat a bowl of oatmeal he didn't really want. The cabin was warm enough. He kept the stove fed and the woodpile stocked, but the warmth didn't go deep anymore. It stopped at the skin. Everything beneath stayed cold. He wrapped a scarf around his neck even indoors now, wore thick socks to bed, Sometimes he forgot where he'd put his boots and just sat on the porch in slippers, listening to the river move beneath the ice. He still said her name, Sarah, most mornings, just after waking. A soft whisper, like saying it was enough to keep the walls from closing in. And maybe it was. He didn't speak it to the photo on the mantel. Didn't need to. That frame had been turned face down years ago when the glass cracked in a spring quake. He'd left it that way. It felt truer now, like her presence lived more in the space than the image. On some days, he walked, not far, just down to the river's edge, using a long stick as a guide. The rocks along the shore were slick, but he moved with practiced care. He breathed with the water, in when it rushed, out when it stilled. The rhythm helped. Gave his body something to follow when memory slipped. He didn't dream much anymore. And when he did, it was mostly sound. Wind through trees, crackling fire, footsteps on old pine boards. But sometimes, just before waking, he'd see them. Not clearly, just movement at the edge of vision. Shapes standing too still in a place that didn't want to be remembered. He never told anyone. Not that there was anyone to tell. The days bled into one another. The sky stayed gray. The snow deepened but didn't pile the way it used to. More like dust settling over everything. A quiet weight. The birds had long since gone. Even the fox that used to leave prints across his porch had vanished. Then one morning he stepped outside and froze. Not from the cold, from the shape in the snow. Two shapes, actually. Footprints. Not boot prints. Not deer. One set large, the other smaller. Each step pressed deep into the crusted surface, spaced evenly, angled away from the tree line. They didn't come close to the cabin. They stopped just near the edge of the clearing, where the snow met the old cedar post fence he never quite finished. The tracks didn't approach, didn't linger. They walked parallel, side by side, then turned gently and vanished back into the woods. He stood there for a long time, not moving, not breathing. There was no wind, no bird song, just the dry crackle of ice shifting along the river's edge and the faint hum of something old in his chest. He didn't go after them, didn't follow. That wasn't what this was. It was a message, a reminder, not for him to find them, but to know they still remembered, that they'd returned as they always had, but chose to stay distant. A respect, a boundary, a kind of quiet love. He sat on the porch that evening, wrapped in his old coat, fingers cradling a mug of tea he didn't drink. The sky was clearing. A few stars blinked through, trembling faintly in the cold. The trees stood still. The snow had begun to harden, crusting over into white glass. He remembered the weight of her hand on his chest, the way it had listened instead of spoken. How silence could be a language if two hearts were willing. The memory stayed close. He didn't need more. That night, he left the porch light on, even though it hadn't worked in years. The bulb burned out sometime after the fire in '95, and he'd never replaced it. But he left it on anyway, as a gesture, as if the light still meant something. As if someone passing might see it and smile. The tracks melted slowly over the following week. Sunlight filtered through the branches, softening the ice in the afternoons. The snow grew thin in patches near the edge of the fence, but he didn't sweep them away. He stepped around them each time he passed, left them whole. He never saw them again that winter, but each morning when he stepped outside, he looked to that spot. And each time, he whispered a quiet thank you, not because he expected an answer, but because gratitude, like grief, lives best when it's shared with the wind. And sometimes, that's all a man can give. Sometimes, that's enough to keep something wild nearby, waiting, and remembering. It was the kind of September that carried its own silence. Not the hush of snow or the stillness of fog, but something thinner, like the trees were holding back. Like the wind was choosing not to speak. The air smelled like pine sap and dry leaves. The sky had that pale blue stretch to it, where you could feel the summer trying to cling to the edges but failing. And down at the old ranger station near Crooked Ridge, a boy named Noah Kane was sweeping the storeroom floor with more questions than answers rattling in his chest. He was 19, all elbows and caution, and carried himself like he'd already been let down by the world a few times too many. There was something in the way he moved, careful but never relaxed, like he never quite believed the room would stay standing if he stopped to catch his breath. He wasn't here because he loved the woods or dreamed of chasing elk through the pines. He was here because it was far from where he came from, and far was the only thing that made sense anymore. The storeroom was cold. Dust hung in the beams of light coming through the high windows. He swept slow, more out of rhythm than effort, his thoughts drifting in circles around nothing. That's when his broom hit something solid. Not the wall, not a shelf. A box. Noah crouched, moving aside a rusted lantern and an old thermos with faded stickers. The box was cedar, heavy, sealed in a way that made it feel intentional. Not stored, hidden. He ran his fingers across the top, felt the ridges of carved initials worn nearly smooth. No lock, just the weight of time. He didn't open it right away. He waited until the sky began to dim and the other rangers had left for the day. Then he carried the box to the back of the bunkhouse, sat on the edge of the cot with a blanket pulled over his legs, and cracked it open. The smell hit first. Dust, sap, something old and warm, like burnt cedar and sun-soaked canvas. Inside were papers folded with care, leather-bound notebooks, pages yellowed and curled at the corners. Some were tied together with twine. He opened one and started to read. The handwriting was steady, masculine, not rushed. At first, the entries were field reports, dates, trail conditions, bear sightings. But then it changed, slowly, almost imperceptibly. The tone softened. The language drifted from observation to memory. There were sketches, maps not found in any official logs, notes in the margins that read more like whispers than information. He read until the lamp burned low. Then he kept reading by moonlight. The name came up again and again. Howe, a ranger long retired, long forgotten by most of the newer staff. Noah remembered the name only vaguely, mentioned once in passing by an older technician who said he used to run the old trails by heart. But that was years ago, before Noah had even finished middle school. The further into the pages he got, the quieter the world around him seemed to become. The entries spoke of something ancient, something that lived where the maps ended. The writing never called it by name, but the weight of its presence filled every sentence. Descriptions of eyes seen through mist, of footprints that appeared without a sound, of gestures exchanged without a word spoken. And then, the silence. The reverent, deliberate silence between them. Noah didn't sleep that night. When the sun rose, his hands were still ink-stained. His heart felt too full, like he'd been given a secret that wasn't his to keep. 2 days passed before he made the hike. He didn't tell anyone. Didn't check in on the board. He packed light, a water bottle, some jerky, a notebook, the journal he couldn't let go of. The trail wasn't marked, but the writing had been precise. He followed the curve of the ridge, took the left fork at the split cedar, crossed the fallen pine that leaned like an old man bowing to the stream. He found the clearing just before noon. It was smaller than he expected, ringed by high trees, grass flattened by years of wind. The air was thick with stillness. Nothing moved, not even the light. He stepped into the space and stopped. He didn't sit right away. He stood for a long time, listening, not just with his ears, but with something deeper, something buried in the part of him that had always felt abandoned. He took a breath, then another, then lowered himself to the grass and crossed his legs. Opened the journal, didn't read from it, just held it, and waited. Hours passed. The shadows stretched long. He didn't move. When the sun dipped behind the ridge, he felt it. Something shifted in the air. The hairs on his arms rose. He looked up. She was there, just inside the tree line, not moving, not breathing loud, watching. Noah froze. His mouth went dry. His heart thudded so loud it made his vision pulse. But he didn't run. He didn't even flinch. He watched her. She stepped forward once. Her fur caught the amber light. She was huge, bigger than he could have imagined. And yet there was something quiet in the way she held herself. Not afraid, not angry, just aware. That's when he saw it. The scar, high along her thigh, a long pale stretch of healed flesh that ran like a memory down through the fur. He knew that scar. It was drawn in the journal, described in soft, uncertain lines, recorded on a morning years ago by hands steadier than his. She stood there, exposed and unhidden, the scar facing him like a name he already knew. He didn't reach for his bag, didn't grab his pen, didn't blink. She watched him a moment longer. Then she turned. Not sharply, not startled, just enough to let the light fall across her back, and she walked away, slowly. No sound, no rush. Like the woods opened for her and closed behind her again. He sat there long after she vanished. The night came quiet and full. He didn't light a fire, didn't check his watch. He just sat there, hand resting on the journal, and tried to hold on to the shape of her silhouette in his mind. Not as proof, but as inheritance, a kind of truth that didn't need to be spoken. A thing passed down not through words or photos or maps, but through stillness, through patience, through the willingness to believe without demand. That night, when he finally returned to the bunkhouse, he placed the journal back inside the cedar box, retied the twine. He didn't lock it, didn't seal it, just let it rest, because the story inside wasn't done yet, and maybe it never would be. Spring returned like a secret that didn't want to be spoken too loudly. It slid through the trees before the snow was done melting, leaving the ground soft and bruised with thaw. Patches of green emerged slow, almost shy, between the roots. The wind changed direction. It carried less bite and more breath, like the land itself was finally exhaling. Down near the old ridge, where the pine canopy cracked open to sky, the clearing looked just as it had in the pages of the journal Noah Kane had once read by lantern light. But now, it felt different, like something had shifted, like something had been let go. He hadn't come for proof. He hadn't come to chase after a shadow or test a theory. He'd come because there were words that needed a place to land. He moved slow, boots pressing into the damp soil without hurry. The journal was tucked under his arm, the same cedar box it came from now empty and sealed back into the supply shed where he'd found it a year ago. This wasn't about finding anything new. This was about finishing something that had never been meant to be complete. The silence greeted him first, that familiar breathless hush that hovered above the grass, broken only by the occasional call of a raven or the rustle of something small slipping through the brush. He stood in the center of the clearing, heart steady, then knelt, laid the journal down on one of the flat stones that circled the edge, like offerings made long before he ever knew this place existed. He opened to the last page. The handwriting had shifted near the end. It wasn't the same confident hand that had charted mountain paths or recorded weather patterns. These were the marks of a man writing slower, pressing harder, as though each word had to be pulled from something deeper than memory. He read it again, one line. She didn't come back for me. Or for you. She came because the land still belonged to her. Noah stared at the sentence for a long while. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small graphite pencil, worn down to half its length. He turned the page, wrote slow. Some things aren't passed through blood. Some things are passed through silence. Then he closed the book and left it there. No camera, no flag, no post online. Just words in a place that didn't need proof to be sacred. He stayed a while after that, let his eyes drift across the treetops, where the first buds were starting to push through winter's grip. The air was clean, carried the scent of wet earth and something older he couldn't name. He turned to leave, took 5 steps, then paused, and saw them, far off, near the tree line, where the shade hadn't yet surrendered to spring. They moved like smoke. The large one came first. Shoulders heavy, arms long, fur the color of old bark and snow. She walked without sound, each step wide and slow. Behind her, smaller, barely 5 feet tall, lighter fur, narrower frame. It paused every few steps to glance behind, as if the world still surprised it. They crossed from shadow into sun. He didn't breathe, didn't blink, didn't move. They never turned to face him, never broke stride, just kept walking side by side, through the clearing and into the far woods, their backs to him like they didn't need to look to know he saw them. And they didn't look back, not once. They disappeared slow, each step quieter than the last, until even the movement of branches behind them stilled. He let out a breath that didn't belong to fear. It was something else. He didn't follow, didn't call, didn't write it down, because not everything sacred belongs on a page. Instead, he walked back to the spot where he'd left the journal, brushed a few pine needles from the cover, then stepped away, left it there. A record, a memory, a place to return to but not disturb. Back at the station, the others were cleaning out the storeroom for spring rotation. A new team would be cycling in soon. Some younger kids, couple interns from Missoula. He didn't offer to help, just took a trash bag and went out along the river trail where tourists had left their usual scattering of granola bar wrappers and plastic water bottles. He moved quiet, stooping to pick up each scrap with a kind of reverence, as if it mattered, as if the act itself meant something more than the mess it removed. He didn't speak all day, didn't need to. That night, he sat by the edge of the deck with a thermos of black coffee cooling beside him. The stars were sharp overhead, pinpricks against the ink of the sky. He looked up at them without searching, just let them be. Because some stories weren't told out loud, some stories were inherited. Not through blood, but through silence, through the willingness to sit still in the clearing, to trust the woods to carry what you couldn't say, to protect what you could never explain. And somewhere, deep in the trees, a mother and child moved unseen. Not because they were afraid, but because the world had finally learned to be quiet long enough to let them pass. Noah smiled, not with joy, not with pride, but with something closer to understanding. Then he stood, walked back inside, and closed the door without turning on the light. The story didn't end there, but it didn't need to continue either. Not yet. There are some stories that don't need a loud ending. They simply taper off like a trail disappearing into tall grass, or a breath let out slowly after a long, silent walk through the woods. What matters most is not where the story began or even how it ended, but what it left behind in the quiet. Sometimes the deepest truths are not the ones shouted from mountaintops, but the ones exchanged in silence, shared between souls that recognize each other without a single word. We live in a world constantly reaching for more noise, more answers, more certainty. But there's a sacred kind of knowing that comes only when we sit still long enough to listen. Some bonds aren't defined by logic or explained by science. They live in gestures, in instinct, in the quiet act of witnessing, in a glance held too long, in a choice made in the dark when no one else was looking. And sometimes what connects us most deeply isn't blood or language. It's the shared decision to protect something we may never fully understand. This was never a tale about monsters or myths. It was about what it means to honor the unknown, to carry someone else's silence as if it were your own, to show up again and again, not for recognition, but because some things deserve to be remembered, even if no one else sees them. Especially then, we all carry pieces of the forest with us, wounds that have never healed quite right, questions without answers, moments that shaped us in ways we can't explain. But maybe that's the point. Not everything is meant to be solved. Some stories are meant to be felt, held, passed on like firelight in cold hands, not to illuminate the whole world, but to warm just one person who needs it. If this story found you in a quiet moment, if it stirred something you thought you'd forgotten, or reminded you of a feeling you never had words for, thank you for listening. Thank you for making space in your heart for the unseen, the misunderstood, the wild, and the gentle. And if you feel moved to share what this story meant to you, or if there's a silence in your life you're learning to honor, leave a comment below. I read every word, and they matter more than you know. If you'd like to walk with us through more stories like this, consider subscribing. Your presence here helps keep these quiet stories alive. Until next time, be kind, stay curious, and listen deeply. The woods are never as empty as they seem.